60 days ago, the most visited island on Earth effectively shut down. Not because of a pandemic, not because of a political crisis, but because the mountain at its center woke up. Right now, as you watch this, Mount Agung is still erupting. It has been erupting every single day for 2 months. Ash columns rising 3, 4, sometimes 5 kilometers into the sky above Bali's eastern highlands. Pyroclastic material raining down on villages that have existed in Agung's shadow for centuries. And an international airport, one of the busiest in Southeast Asia, repeatedly forced to close its runways because the ash cloud drifting westward makes flying impossible. 4 million tourists. That's the number that keeps appearing in every briefing, every news report, every emergency meeting. 4 million people who either fled, couldn't land, had their bookings cancelled, or are still stranded trying to figure out what comes next. The economic damage is already being described as catastrophic by Indonesian tourism officials. We're talking about billions of dollars in losses, and the eruption hasn't stopped. But here's what the headlines aren't fully capturing. This isn't just a tourism story. This is a volcano story. And the question that volcanologists are wrestling with right now, the question that should matter to anyone paying attention, is whether 60 days of continuous eruption represents the peak of this event or the beginning of something considerably more serious. That's what we're going to work through today. The science of what's happening inside Agung right now. What the monitoring data is. Actually saying, what happened the last time this mountain erupted in earnest, and what the credible scenarios look like if this situation continues to escalate. To understand why this eruption has shaken the global travel industry to its foundation, you have to understand what Bali actually is. Not the postcard version, but the geological and economic reality sitting underneath all those rice terraces and Instagram sunsets. Bali is a small island. We're talking roughly 5,600 square kilometers, about the size of the state of Delaware. But it packs somewhere between 4.2 and 4.5 million residents into that space, plus the extraordinary weight of an international tourism economy that, in peak years, brings in over 6 million foreign visitors annually. Tourism doesn't just contribute to Bali's economy. For enormous portions of the island, tourism is the economy. Hotels, restaurants, drivers, guides, artisans, farmers supplying those restaurants, the financial web connects almost everything. Now drop a stratovolcano into the middle of that picture. Mount Agung sits in Bali's eastern region, in Karangasem Regency, and it rises to 3,631 meters above sea level. That makes it the highest point on the island, visible from almost everywhere on clear days. A permanent, dramatic presence on the horizon that Balinese Hindu tradition regards as the home of the gods, literally the navel of the world. Pura Besakih, one of the most sacred temple complexes in all of Hinduism, sits on Agung's southwestern slope at roughly 1,000 meters elevation. This mountain isn't just geological infrastructure. It's the spiritual and cultural center of an entire civilization. And it is also, unambiguously, one of the most dangerous volcanoes in Indonesia. Which is saying something, because Indonesia sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire and hosts more than 130 active volcanoes. This is the most volcanically active nation on the planet. But even within that extraordinary catalog of geological hazards, Agung commands special attention. What makes the current situation genuinely unprecedented, and that word gets overused, so let's be precise about it, is the combination of factors converging simultaneously. The duration of this eruptive episode is exceptional. 60 days of continuous activity represents a sustained engagement from this volcanic system. That goes beyond the typical pattern of short, sharp eruptions followed by quiet intervals. The scale of the human disruption, with a major international airport serving as the crisis fulcrum, means that the consequences aren't staying local. They're radiating outward through global flight networks, through tour operator balance sheets, through the plans of millions of people on every continent who had Bali somewhere in their near future. And perhaps most critically, the eruption doesn't appear to be winding down on any schedule that scientists feel confident predicting. Comparable situations? Volcanologists sometimes reference the 2010 eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland, which paralyzed European air travel for weeks and caused roughly $1.3 billion in losses to the airline industry. Or Kilauea in Hawaii, which maintained continuous eruptive activity for decades in some form. But Agung's specific combination of explosive potential, population density, and tourism dependency creates a risk profile that's genuinely its own category. Mount Agung isn't just venting steam. Beneath that crater, a system of pressurized magma chambers and fractured conduits is driving one of the most sustained eruptive episodes this volcano has produced in decades. And understanding the mechanics of what's happening inside that mountain is essential to understanding why volcanologists aren't breathing easy yet. Agung is what geologists classify as a stratovolcano, also called a composite volcano. And that classification matters enormously. Stratovolcanoes are built from alternating layers of hardened lava, volcanic ash, and other ejected material accumulated over thousands of years of eruptions. They tend to be steep-sided, visually dramatic, and capable of producing some of the most violent explosive eruptions on Earth. Think Vesuvius. Think Pinatubo. Think Krakatoa. These are all stratovolcanoes, and they share a fundamental characteristic. They don't just quietly ooze lava the way shield volcanoes like those in Hawaii do. They build pressure. They can, under certain conditions, explode. The reason stratovolcanoes behave this way comes down to magma chemistry. The magma feeding Agung is high in silica, a compound that dramatically increases the viscosity of molten rock. Think of the difference between pouring water and pouring cold honey. Low silica basaltic magma flows relatively freely, allowing gases to escape gradually. High silica andesitic or dacitic magma, the kind feeding Agung, is thick, sticky, resistant. Gases trying to escape from that magma get trapped. Pressure builds. And when it finally releases, it doesn't just flow, it can fragment explosively, hurling superheated rock, ash, and gas at velocities that defy intuition. What's been happening over these 60 days is a process volcanologists describe as open vent activity, meaning the conduit connecting the magma chamber to the surface is open, allowing material to vent more or less continuously. This is, in a complex way, potentially stabilizing. An open vent releases pressure incrementally, rather than allowing catastrophic buildup. But it is emphatically not safe, and it is not permanent. Open vent systems can transition. Conduits can partially block. New pathways can form. And the deeper question, the one that monitoring data is being interrogated to answer, is whether the magma supply feeding this system is itself increasing, decreasing, or holding steady. Indonesia's volcanological agencies have been measuring SO2 emissions from Agung throughout this eruptive period, and those measurements are one of the most valuable diagnostic tools available. Sulfur dioxide is released when magma degasses. It comes up with the magma from depth. Elevated SO2 output indicates fresh magma arriving from deeper in the system. In the weeks leading up to and during the initial intensification of this eruption, SO2 measurements spiked to levels that indicated substantial fresh magma input. The question of whether those levels have stabilized or continue to indicate new material arriving from depth is one of the central monitoring concerns right now. Seismic data tells another part of the story. In the weeks and months preceding major volcanic events, seismographs typically detect a characteristic pattern of activity. Deep, low-frequency earthquakes indicating fluid movement at depth, followed by shallower high-frequency tremors as that material forces its way through rock toward the surface. The seismic network around Agung has been recording hundreds of events weekly throughout this eruptive period. Some of those events are what volcanologists call volcanic tremor, a sustained, rhythmic shaking that often correlates directly with magma movement through conduits. Tremor doesn't stop, it persists. And persistent tremor, maintained across 60 days, indicates a volcanic system that remains actively engaged at depth. Ground deformation data adds another layer. GPS stations and tiltmeters positioned around Agung's flanks measure subtle changes in the volcano's shape. Inflation indicating magma accumulation, deflation indicating release. These instruments are extraordinarily sensitive. They can detect changes of millimeters across distances of kilometers. What they've been recording throughout this eruptive period. The precise nature, of that deformation is being closely analyzed by the PVMBG, Indonesia's Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation, along with international research partners. Here's where it gets genuinely complex. A volcano that's been erupting for 60 days has been releasing material and energy. That release could mean the system is gradually exhausting itself, working through a finite supply of pressurized magma. Or it could mean something quite different, that the volcanic system is well connected to a substantial magma source and has the capacity to sustain this activity or intensify it for a considerably longer period. Distinguishing between those two scenarios requires integrating seismic data, gas measurements, ground deformation readings, and direct visual observation of the crater. WIN. FIDES. Constant, multi-layered analysis that scientists are performing around the clock. What we know with confidence, this eruption has lasted far longer than typical short-duration Agung activity. The ash columns being generated are reaching sufficient altitude to contaminate flight paths across a wide area. Pyroclastic density currents, fast-moving flows of superheated gas and volcanic material, and have been observed descending Agung's flanks during periods of heightened activity, representing one of the most dangerous volcanic hazards there is. And the volcanic exclusion zone around the crater, which restricts access for both local residents and anyone else, remains in effect. The last major eruption of Mount Agung didn't just reshape Bali's landscape. It killed more than 1,500 people, buried entire villages, and left scars on the island's collective memory that still haven't fully healed. The year was 1963. Bali in 1963 was a different world, far less connected to global tourism, far less economically integrated, but no less deeply inhabited by communities who had built their lives on and around this mountain for generations. Pura Besaki, the mother temple, was preparing for Ekadasa Rudra, a purification ceremony held only once every 100 years. The timing felt sacred. The mountain, Balinese tradition held, was the seat of the divine. The ceremony had been planned for months, and then the mountain began to move. In February 1963, reports started filtering in from villages near Agung summit. Unusual sounds, ground tremors, the smell of sulfur on the wind. On February 18th, the volcano erupted for the first time, sending lava flows down its northern and southern flanks. The religious ceremony was not cancelled. Some leaders believed the eruption was itself part of a divine process, a sign of the mountain's power rather than a warning to flee. Communities stayed. On March 17, 1963, Agung entered a phase of catastrophic explosive activity. The eruption column reached an estimated 8 to 10 kilometers into the atmosphere. Pyroclastic flows, those superheated avalanches of gas and volcanic material moving, at speeds that can exceed 700 kilometers per hour, surged down the volcano's flanks. They reached villages, they reached farmland, they reached communities that had assumed, or hoped, or prayed that the mountain would spare them. The death toll from the 1963 eruption is estimated at between 1,500 and 2,000 people. Some sources put it higher. Entire villages on Agung's slopes were obliterated. Agricultural land that had supported families for generations was buried under meters of volcanic debris. The ashfall affected the entire island. Crops failed, water sources were contaminated, and the economic impact on an already poor rural population was devastating. A secondary eruption in May 1963 extended the disaster, killing additional hundreds. What's deeply relevant about 1963 is not just the death toll, it's the pattern. The 1963 eruption began with a period of lower-level activity that some observers initially hoped might represent the full extent of the event. It didn't. The initial activity was, in retrospect, precursory to the catastrophic phase that followed. Scientists studying the 1963 event have documented how the eruption column heights, the volumes of ejected material, and the seismic signatures escalated before the worst phases. Now, and this comparison must be made carefully, with full acknowledgement of the many ways the current situation differs from 1963, scientists monitoring Agung today are acutely aware of that historical pattern. The 1963 precedent shapes how Indonesian volcanologists interpret current data. It is the reference event. It is why exclusion zones are maintained with such seriousness. It is why, when Agung began showing elevated seismicity and ground deformation in the period before this current eruption began, evacuation orders went out quickly. There are meaningful differences, of course. Modern monitoring is incomparably more sophisticated than anything available in 1963. The network of seismographs, GPS stations, gas sensors, and satellite-based observation tools surrounding Agung today would have seemed like science fiction to the volcanologists of that era. Evacuation infrastructure is better. Communication systems are better. The scientific understanding of how stratovolcanoes behave is considerably more advanced. But the mountain's underlying geology hasn't changed. The same magmatic system that produced the 1963 catastrophe is the same system that is active today. And volcanologists are honest about this. Understanding a volcanic system better doesn't mean controlling it. It means you can potentially see what's coming with more lead time. Whether that lead time is sufficient, and whether the communities and infrastructure around Agung are positioned to use it effectively, is a genuinely open question. Indonesia's Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation, PVMBG, has had Agung under continuous surveillance throughout this eruptive period, and what their instruments are recording right now is keeping volcanologists attentive in ways that go beyond routine monitoring. The alert level system used by PVMBG runs from level 1, normal, through level 3, awas, meaning beware or warning, the highest designation. During the current eruption, Agung has been maintained at level 3, siaga, meaning standby, for extended periods with brief elevations to level 4 during the most intense eruptive phases. Level 3 means, in practical terms, that a 4-kilometer exclusion zone around the crater is enforced, that communities within that radius should be prepared to evacuate rapidly, and that monitoring teams are on heightened watch around the clock. The seismic picture over the past 60 days has included several distinct patterns that volcanologists track carefully. Volcanic tremor, that sustained rhythmic shaking associated with fluid movement, has persisted through much of this period. Individually catalogued earthquake events, including both shallow high-frequency events and deeper low-frequency signals, have been recorded in substantial numbers. What volcanologists look for in this data is change. Acceleration, deepening of event locations, shifts in the frequency content, any of which could signal a transition in the volcanic system's behavior. SO2 flux measurements, conducted both by ground-based spectrometers and satellite instruments, particularly the Tropomi instrument on the European Space Agency's Sentinel-5P satellite, have provided near real-time tracking of sulfur dioxide emissions throughout the eruption. Satellite SO2 data has the advantage of capturing the full extent of the volcanic plume, including material lofted to high altitudes, and has been used to track the dispersal of Agung's emissions across Indonesia and into international airspace. These measurements directly inform the aviation NOTAMs, notices to airmen, that have repeatedly forced Igusti Ngurah Rai International Airport to suspend operations. That airport closure dynamic is worth pausing on because it illustrates how the consequences of this eruption extend far beyond Bali's immediate vicinity. When ash reaches the airport, it's not just an inconvenience. Volcanic ash is catastrophically dangerous to aircraft engines. Ash particles, when ingested by jet turbines, melt at engine operating temperatures and re-solidify on turbine components, causing engine failure. There are well-documented cases of aircraft losing all engine power after flying through volcanic ash clouds. The aviation industry takes this hazard with extraordinary seriousness, and the Volcanic Ash Advisory Centers, international bodies that track ash dispersal globally, have been continuously issuing advisories for the Agung plume. The gap in readiness that volcanologists and emergency management officials quietly worry about is the scenario of rapid escalation. Current evacuation zones, exclusion perimeters, and emergency protocols are calibrated for the current level of activity. They are not automatically sufficient for a significantly larger eruption. The communities living between 4 and 8 kilometers from Agung's crater, outside the current exclusion zone but well within the potential impact radius of a more powerful eruptive episode, are in a particularly uncertain position. Official guidance for those communities exists, but the human reality of evacuation, of leaving homes, animals, livelihoods, creates friction that emergency planners acknowledge they cannot fully eliminate through preparation alone. Here's the question that every volcanologist watching Agung is quietly turning over. What happens if 60 days of continuous eruption isn't the peak of this event, but the prologue? The science of volcanic escalation is, by its nature, probabilistic rather than predictive. Scientists cannot tell you with certainty that Agung will or won't enter a more explosive phase. What they can do, and what researchers at institutions, including the PVMBG, the Global Volcanism Program at the Smithsonian Institution, and university volcanology departments tracking Indonesian volcanic systems, are actively doing, is model the range of plausible scenarios and estimate their relative likelihood based on monitoring data. The lower-end scenario, which remains possible and would obviously be the preferred outcome, is that the current open vent eruptive activity continues to gradually decline as the immediate magma pressure driving it is exhausted. Eruption column heights decrease. SO2 emissions drop. Seismic activity tapers. The system moves back toward a lower alert level over weeks or months. Bali begins the long, painful process of tourism recovery. This scenario is genuinely possible. It's not wishful thinking. It's one legitimate reading of the current data. The more alarming scenarios involve escalation. If the magma supply feeding Agung's conduit system were to increase, driven by fresh material rising from deeper in the crust, the eruption could intensify significantly. A partial or complete blockage of the existing conduit, followed by pressure buildup and sudden release, could generate a much larger explosive event. Models based on the 1963 eruption suggest that a comparable event today could produce pyroclastic flows reaching distances of 10 to 12 kilometers from the summit, potentially impacting communities currently outside the exclusion zone. An eruption column reaching 10 or more kilometers altitude could inject material into the stratosphere, with implications for aviation across Southeast Asia, and, depending on the volume of sulfur dioxide released, potentially minor effects on regional climate patterns over following months. The tsunami risk in an extreme scenario deserves mention, though it requires careful framing. Agung's position in eastern Bali means that significant collapse of volcanic material into the sea, a scenario associated with very large eruptions, could theoretically generate locally significant waves affecting coastal areas of eastern Bali and nearby islands. This is not a prediction. It is a physical possibility that emergency modeling includes precisely because responsible disaster planning requires considering low probability, high consequence scenarios. For Bali's economy, even the continuation of current activity, without escalation, represents a potentially existential crisis for significant portions of the island's population. Tourism infrastructure built and financed over decades has operating costs that don't pause because a volcano is erupting. Hotels, staffed and mortgaged, sitting empty. Tour operators with no clients. Drivers with no fares. The social and economic secondary effects of extended volcanic disruption could persist long after Agung quiets, simply because traveler confidence takes time to rebuild. 60 days of continuous eruption on one of the most consequential volcanic islands on the planet isn't a footnote in a geological journal. It's a signal about the nature of this volcanic system, about the fragility of economies built in the shadow of active volcanoes, and about the genuinely unresolved question of what comes next. What we know with confidence is this: Mount Agung is a capable and historically documented destroyer. The 1963 eruption isn't ancient history. There are people alive today on Bali who remember it. The communities in Agung's shadow understand, in a way that statistics can't fully capture, what this mountain is capable of. Their resilience is not passive. It is the active, lived knowledge of people who have chosen, generation after generation, to build their lives in proximity to something powerful and unpredictable. What scientists can tell us is that monitoring has never been better, that the signals coming from Agung are being read with tools and expertise that didn't exist in 1963, and that the current alert system gives communities more lead time than they have ever had before. That matters. It has almost certainly already saved lives in the current eruptive period. What honest volcanology cannot tell us is when this ends, or what level it reaches before it does. Mount Agung will make that determination on its own timeline, according to physics and chemistry operating kilometers beneath the surface, beyond anyone's control. If you're watching this from Bali, or planning travel there, follow PVMBG guidance and official Indonesian government advisories. Those are the authoritative sources, updated in real time with actual monitoring data. If you're simply trying to understand what's happening on one of Earth's most watched volcanic islands right now, the short answer is an ongoing geological event of real significance, monitored closely, with outcomes still genuinely uncertain. The geological forces shaping this story have been building for millennia. The next chapter is being written right now. In seismic readings, in SO2 measurements, in the decisions of families living on Agung slopes, and in the monitoring stations staffed around the clock by volcanologists who understand better than anyone both how much we know and how much remains beyond prediction. Stay informed. The situation is active. If this kind of deep dive analysis is what you're looking for, the science underneath the headlines, the historical context that changes how you understand current events, then subscribing means you won't miss the next one. We're tracking several other volcanic systems in the Pacific Ring of Fire showing elevated activity right now, and at least one of them has a population exposure profile that makes Agung's situation look manageable by comparison. That story is coming soon. You won't want to miss it. Drop a comment below. Are you watching this from Indonesia? Have you been affected by the airport closures? Or are you following this from somewhere else and just trying to understand what's actually happening? Either way, this community learns better together. Let's keep the conversation going.